Thank you all for coming. So I'm, as you know, I'm Bill Alford, faculty member here at the law school, and delighted to receive so many of our friends, delegations from the education school and FAS, other parts of the university. So today is a chance to introduce again our Harvard Law School program on disability. I'll say a few words and then turn the floor over to my dear friend, Professor Michael Stein. So Michael and I created the program in 2004 to assist as the United Nations drafted the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We will hear a little later from one of the primary authors of that convention, Ambassador Luis Gallegos. Since that time, over 150 countries have taken upon themselves, signed and ratified the UN Conventions, have taken on themselves obligations to meet a certain standard with regard to disability issues. And many of them, it turns out, are found that they, needed to revise their disability law and policy, in some cases create disability law and policy. And they began to turn to the world's greatest expert on disability rights and law issues, Professor Michael Stein. And so we, through our HPOD program for the last 11 years, have on a pro bono basis offered advice on these issues. Let me just say a very quick word or two about that before I turn the floor to Michael. What we've tried to do is sort of marry the comparative law learning of the Harvard Law School with the great, again, expertise of Michael and other friends about disability law and disability rights issues. And so we've tried to craft in different countries, and over the last 11 years, we've probably worked in 40 or more countries, although we concentrate in a much smaller subset. But we try to marry our comparative law learning with the disability law expertise so that we don't come with a single set of solutions or a single model. It's often the case Americans show up and say, here's how we do it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New York, you must do it that way. Not at all. We try to adapt what we do, working on equal footing with local partners, many of whom now have become very dear friends, and some fully engaged in the Harvard Law School project, to craft approaches that are respectful of and cognizant of different ways of approaching these issues. And as we do this, we find we learn more and more as we go on. And Michael will tell you in more detail, because he really is the fulcrum of our activity, but we work with governments on advising about law and policy. We work with universities. That's been very gratifying to help universities in many countries for the first time establish programs about disability issues and the law or policy. In China, for example, we did the first conference ever in the history of China on disability and law, bringing, thanks to Michael and Harvard's network, experts from 7 or 8 different countries to talk about 7 or 8 different approaches to creating a more respectful context and environment for persons with disabilities. We work with family groups, with persons with disabilities directly, teaching self-advocacy. We work with disabled persons organizations and other NGOs, and it's enormously fulfilling. Let me quickly introduce some of our other dear colleagues and then turn the floor to Michael. So Dr. Cui Fangming is director of our China programs and herself a doctor in special education and just extraordinary in her work. Mona Indigari from Saudi Arabia is trained as a therapist herself and enormously thoughtful, and it's a joy to work with her. Alonso Emery, there's Alonso. Alonso is a faculty member at the law school and has worked with us for many years on disability issues. Behind Alonso is Juliette Bowler, who keeps us all coherent, at least as much as I am, and is responsible for all the arrangements today, so I want to thank her very much for that. Hezi Smith is here, has come back, hey Hezi, from initially in Bangladesh and more recently in Mexico for many years working with us, and it's been a joy. So I think with that, I will turn the floor to Michael Stein. Michael is amazing. I'll quickly embarrass him for a minute. So Michael is a top of his class at NYU, and then a PhD from the University of Cambridge in legal history, and then Harvard Law School, where he was a brilliant, stellar student, the first person with visible disability on the Harvard Law Review, and is a professor here at Harvard. And I every day learn in many, many ways from working with Michael about the substance of disability issues, but just in terms of emotional intelligence and sort of what one can do in the world to make it better.
I certainly cannot live up to those words, but the advantage of going second is that I could tell you that every day it's a pleasure to work with Vice Dean Professor Alford, but it's a great challenge to try to live up to his standards of wisdom and kindness and essential goodness. He pours his heart and time, pro bono always, into the project, and it's just been a wonderful partnership, and I'm very, very grateful for it. The best thing I can say about HPOD, if you're going to leave with one thing in mind, and I say it often, is I'm not exactly sure how I got to that place, but I get to work with people I love, for people I love, on projects that I love. And some of you already work with us, and I hope others will join, because there's more work than all of us can do. And we love collaborating and working together. And I also will wave to one of our local collaborators, Representative Thomas Sanacandra. Absolutely, if you're a person with a disability in the state of Massachusetts, your best friend. So we love Tom. Professor Alford spoke about HPOD, and everything is accurate and right. I would just highlight a few things, which is in our work we try to seek innovative solutions that are culturally sensitive and appropriate, and those terms now have become a bit jargoned and overused, but we really do mean it. So when Dr. Tsui and others are working in China, we work with groups of journalists with disabilities who have posted stories about the lives of people with disabilities, sometimes overcoming barriers, sometimes continuing to engage in barriers, done in ways that, thank God, not yet, have not raised the ire of the political bureaus, but have gone out to untold millions of people, letting them know who this other is, who this group that is often invisible is. And in our work with families, because Bill has described the large ambit of work that we do, but the sweet spot is always working with civil society. We see law up here, and sometimes we're with law and help revise constitutions or do landmark litigation. We've been very lucky on that. And people are down here, and there's a gap in between. The governments, even well-intended, sometimes don't have the knowledge or the will or the resources. And we leverage civil society. We leverage the people whose lives are involved, who have the most at stake, who have the most knowledge, who have the most passion to work with us, but always in humility. We view our role as serving, as being at the behest of our clients and in support of them rather than engaging. So in China, for example, the work with family groups and trying to get children with intellectual disabilities, autism, etc., into the school system and into their communities, we come up with novel solutions. She's so clever. The last training we did together with migrants and disabled children of migrants, and that was probably one of the hardest trainings we've done in years, because we're in a very small room, and the migrants are there, and the children are there because there's no one to take care of them. And the parents are openly discussing having thought about abandoning their children. Some had talked about ending their children's lives. Others thought about sending them back to the countryside. And Dr. Tsui, in her wisdom, says, well, let's get some of the successful people with disabilities. Not the ones that are in the press, but the ones who are living everyday lives like everyone else and overcoming barriers and succeeding. And we even had one young man who looked as if he had cerebral palsy, but he doesn't. He was post-meningitis, a very large wheelchair, and he's about to get his doctorate in computer science. And there he was speaking to the families about, you have hope, there are prospects, there are possibilities. Or when we worked in the Philippines to try to get children with visual and multiple disabilities into the school system, our choices were to either spend all our time and resources in trying to bring a Brown v. Board of Ed type case, if such thing was even possible within the context of the Philippines, or instead to work with the parent group that we've been supporting for years, who have managed to get their children into school and to teach them to be what we called caseworkers, to go out and to find the other parents whose children were not in school, and to reach out and say, I know where you've been, I've been there. My children are now in school, let me take you by the hand, let's do this together and work together. And the last time we did a wave of that work, over 600 children with visual and multiple disabilities were enrolled and remain enrolled in the school system in central Manila. It makes us feel very good. Or, for example, when Hezi was working with the Sea Trust, the group of autistic self-advocates, young adults and adults, and they wanted to reach out to their communities because they weren't seen, they weren't heard, and they created a series of plays, a series of documentaries. You can see them on YouTube. And they went out and engaged with their peer groups. And they put on these performances. And they talked about why we belong, why we're here. And then they, not us and not the experts, they ran focus groups, sat down with their age peers and with their community groups and said, here's who I am. Here's what my life is like. Here's why I belong. Can we interact with each other? And that's what we mean by innovative solutions. We really do mean it. And I think one of the things that we're very proud of and that we're very pleased and hope to share more of, and we've been discussing a lot of this with the ambassador over the last few days, is that these are solutions arising from the global south. These are developing countries and communities coming up with solutions, not with resources, not with northern, western developed ideas, but figuring out what works for them on the ground, in their countries, in their cities, in their places, or if you like, in Eleanor Roosevelt's words, around the kitchen table. It was not we coming in with resources and ideas, it was their ideas worked together. And if we're going to make this human rights agenda, whether it's disability rights or otherwise, work, we need to work and we need to share as equal partners. And so I think we're very proud, collectively, of those efforts. We have a great and distinct pleasure to present Ambassador Luis Gallegos to you today. It's a great honor to spend time with him. We can give you his bona fides, which is on the poster, but it wouldn't really do him much credit or enough credit. Ecuador's ambassador to the U.S., to UN Geneva, to UN New York, UN Expert Committee on Torture. Professor Alfred referred to him as one of the primary drafters of the CRPD, but I think we also have to recognize him as one of the primary parents. He will talk about the CRPD, but in the early days, it was his cleverness and dedication to inclusion that has changed not only the CRPD's development, but also UN Human Rights Treaty development. Until this CRPD, there were not the members engaged. The stakeholders were not engaged in the negotiations. And the ambassador, as the early chair, said, well, wait a minute, since we're mandated to think about whether we should have a convention, how can we possibly do that without the group? And besides his cleverness, there was the force of his will, his devotion, thinking about how to get disability groups under the NGO loophole of ECOSOC to participate. His work, often in, we can say it, in pushback to the U.S.'s position at the time to get them to come around to other positions. His advocacy on behalf of family support groups, who in the early days were often pushed to the side by some of the more aggressive disability rights groups. You're not part of our community. You're not really disabled. Don't come here. But that would only give you a fraction of the picture. We have a convention because of his will and his intelligence and his great diplomatic abilities. But beyond that, I have to say that one of the great pleasures of working with him, and besides the CRPD, we've also been privileged to work with the ambassador in several countries, is just his essential goodness. So sitting with him on the day that the convention was adopted, first on the floor of the General Assembly, and then afterwards, at his gracious invitation to lunch in the ambassador's luncheon. And it was his birthday. But his entire pleasure was not about, here's a convention I created. It was about, this is good. I am so happy. We have achieved a great victory. Or afterwards, at the White House when the president announced the signing and introduced the ambassador, his just complete joy at the idea that we're moving forward. And the U.S., despite some very early interactions, actually will sign it and will consider its ratification. We didn't quite get there, we hope to, but just his essential goodness at doing social justice, at achieving things. And also his modesty. At the UN, during the breaks between the sessions, the ambassador, with paper bag in hand, was sitting down with the civil society groups and having lunch and trying to understand what their perspective was and, are they being drowned out by the states? Are we making sure that we hear this? Am I being fair and inclusive and representative? And, every group fails ultimately to be as representative as it should be, and that includes the disability rights community. We don't include people with intellectual disabilities, people with autism, people with mental disabilities as much as we should. But there he was with his paper bag, sitting down and having lunch. So it's a very, very great honor to spend time with you, and we're so delighted to have you. Thank you for honoring us, and please share.
Thank you very much. I just start with a joke. It's very common in the United States to say, I paid him to say that. But I admire him too much to do that. And I have a written text. I'll divert from it. I will try to tell you the nature of what we did, and I think it was an important issue in the negotiations. I am fundamentally a diplomat. I'm a professional diplomat. I've been working for the Foreign Service of Ecuador for 48 years. I feel very honored to do that. I now am on sabbatical leave working for the United Nations in UNITAR, which is the Training and Capacity Building Institute and Research Institute of the United Nations. It's a sort of a series of alignment of stars which led me to this phase with the CRPD. I was ambassador in Geneva in '98, and a group of civil society disabled organizations came to talk to me about the possibility of proposing a resolution in the Human Rights Commission on the issues of persons with disabilities who were not covered adequately by other treaty organs of the United Nations that were supposed to. So we did that. We approved a resolution, and that resolution went up in grade and got to the General Assembly, and it evolved. It evolved into creating in 2001 a working group tasked with elaborating or at the beginning thinking about the possibility of drafting a convention on persons with disabilities. I normally tell a story about that because I was a vice president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and one of my obligations was to facilitate the reform of the Security Council, a very, very lost cause. I spent 2 years trying to do any evolution of that, and it was simply not possible. And I was also a member of the committee, of the executive committee of UNICEF and the executive committee of the UNDP. So Ecuadorian missions are small missions; they are not huge establishments. And when they asked me to chair this negotiation and this working group, I went to my people and told them, look, I'm being asked to that, and they said, no way, we can't do that. We can't really look into a serious endeavor of that type. We would need probably one person for every 2 articles that we would negotiate to facilitate this. It's a very complex issue, and we don't have the. We would need that they duplicate our human resources, which was not a possibility. But that night I talked to my wife, and Fabiola is very much a guiding light. And I told her, look, this is an issue on disability, and I told her the antecedents to this. And And she said, look, why don't you do this? Because, this issue of the vice presidency of the General Assembly or the facilitator will take months, but this is going to be very, very easy. Who politically can be against disability? It's politically incorrect to be against disability. This thing will be very easy. You sit down, you draft it, and it'll fly. So we accepted it. And the first meeting, let me tell you very honestly, I was in shock because the United States was completely against it, and so were the Europeans. And there were a group of countries who followed the lead of these very powerful countries who also were against it. And there were a few of the smaller and medium-range countries who thought that there was a need. Different philosophies in reality. Most of the countries who thought it was a need because they thought they would acquire through an international instrument a guideline for their internal legislation, as Michael was just saying. So we had a confrontation on the floor of that meeting. And the confrontation was not something that I like. Of course, being a diplomat, what I try to do is put wills together and political wills together in order to obtain a result. In politics, the definition I use is normally that, the result is what is possible, not necessarily what I would aspire to be the result. But we really ran into a brick wall with the United States, and so we had to do a lot of lobbying in other parts of the world. I traveled to Brussels and talked to the commissioners of the Europeans and so on. And I went to China, to Deng Pufang, and I became a good friend of his. And I traveled to India and others. And of course, we got a critical mass in order to proceed with the negotiation. This negotiation was based on the capabilities of the disability communities of the world, the disability societies of the world. They are the ones who are the success story here. They went to the halls of the United Nations. They went to the meetings of the United Nations. They sat down. They learned, and it's true. Michael is part of this endeavor, and I'll tell you why we became so entwined between the two of us. As a chair of this bureau, the bureau was composed of one member from each region, one country member for each region. I was the chair, and we agreed that we did not know anything about disability, and those diplomats like us who were sitting down in the halls of Room 4 in the United Nations weren't experts on disability. They were talented diplomats who were doing a negotiation that they did not know the substantive matter. So we needed the input of persons with disabilities. We needed the input of their associations, their civil society, the World Health Organization, and the mechanisms that the United Nations had put in place for over two decades on these issues: disability and labor rights, disability and health, disability and development. And we sat down with this. But having come from a human rights background and having worked in Geneva, I learned very, very early that the relationship between civil society and the delegations is extremely important. One, because they have to be informed of what the process is that we are having is about. Many of those groups are very well intentioned, but don't really know the techniques that are used in the negotiation. And therefore, we devised a means by which I created a group of advisors called the Friends of Chair, and Michael was one of the stars of this group. And there were members of the group from different parts of the world, from Australia, from Africa, from Europe, and we sat down to really formulate a position and be able to aid not only the delegations of countries, but also the civil society on how to articulate instead of combating each other, because they went into those halls, each one with their own agenda, the blind against the deaf and the deaf against the... So they really fought it out in this thing, and it was to the delight of those who were opposed to it. By the end of the negotiation, the speeches by the disability community were much more structured than any one of the country delegations. They had learned, they had advised, they received advice, expert advice on how to do this, and they negotiated brilliantly. But in the regulations of the General Assembly, the negotiation is amongst countries. It's an intergovernmental organization. And many of the countries did not like the idea of integrating disabled persons in their delegations, which I had asked for explicitly, and I did a lobbying all the countries to send people with disability from their countries. But they were also very adamant to having civil society pressure them, because this is a diplomat negotiating in New York, while civil society in his country is pressuring Congress, his parliament, and others to do what should be done, and therefore it was becoming a complication for the delegations in New York. And they simply did not, some countries simply did not believe that this negotiation should integrate persons with disabilities. This is the governments, and the governments are going to decide, and we know what's best, and so on. So in a particular moment there, Michael was referring to this, in a particular moment, and after months of negotiation, we came to the crunch of the matter when I had to present the chairman's statement on letting people with disabilities participate in the negotiation, although they were not integrate governmental delegations. And I formulated the document very carefully, but I met with an enormous opposition, both from countries that like the United States and Europe, but also with Africans and Asians. And so we had to negotiate very, very hard to get that document. If someone opposes a chairman's statement, it's done, and it can't be repeated. So I was trying to be very careful in this. And in some cases, I had to really go to the prime minister or president of the country who was opposing this, and try to get him to instruct his delegation in New York to do this. But they approved it. So the convention in synthesis is a 50-article text, which was a success story in the annals of negotiation. When I first went into this, I asked my secretariat from the UN, how long is this going to take? And they said, well, this is going to take 12 years. And I said, I don't have 12 years for this. No, I won't be here 12 years. So, it has to be faster than that. No, it's very difficult because, the last treaty took us 12 years and the other one took us 14. So I said, no, forget this. Time is of the essence, so we duplicated the meetings and so on. Another thing that sort of broke the traditions of the United Nations, I'd say sort of, but broke the traditions of the United Nations, was Internet. Because Internet, there were a couple of young women in the back who belong to an organization. One of them is the renowned Janet Lord and Kathy Gersney, who now works in the State Department. They were sitting in the back with their laptops, and you could see them from the podium. They were doing something that the United Nations had never done before, which was informing the general public through Internet what the negotiation was about and what was happening, and what the delegation from X country and Y country was saying. And this, of course, meant that those people in their countries would actively participate in the negotiation, going to pressure the points of decision in that country to change the position or to applaud the position that was being held in New York. Normally, what happens is that when you talk on the microphone in the United Nations, it's registered. This is what was created in 1945. You talked, they taped you, they transcribed the thing, and 2 or 3 years later, you had the minutes of the meeting. Okay, but here, I was telling Ming that I was walking in China one day near Guangdong, and a disabled person comes up to me and says, "You're Ambassador Gallegos from the committee." I said, "Yes." "How do you know?" "Well, I translate you to Chinese because this issue became a sort of worldwide issue. The first, the convention was approved in 2006, and he jokes about it because it's true. on the 13th of December, which was my birthday. So nothing. I had nothing to do with that, but we celebrated. But the reality is that the first in the first days of the convention, 80 countries signed it, and now 159 countries have signed it, and 157 have ratified it. The United States has not ratified it yet. We hope that they get the votes in Congress and the Senate to ratify the convention. And I know some marvelous people in Congress who have worked very diligently for that. And the disability community of the United States has been outstanding in their work here. But it is an instrument, a tool, which has to be applied and grounded in every country. Therefore, changes in legislation, and in many cases, non-legislation, because we did this analysis after the convention was approved, and you had 70 countries that didn't have legislation on disability. Disability was the invisible, the discriminated, the segregated, those who caused people to hide. And the shame was one of product of ignorance, in many cases of religion. You have to take all these factors into consideration to acknowledge the difficulties of application of this thing. Defining disability was a challenge. So the convention has a number of articles which you when you read them you'll understand much more on education, on health, on life, on the right to life. But you're extremely impressed by an individual who cannot see and is deaf, who's the president of a disability organization, whose only reference is a Braille keyboard, and who can speak about his life saying, my mother decided to have me in spite of my disability, which was announced to her. And my life depended on that decision. What we're talking about here on the life of persons with disability, you should consider very much that most of people with disabilities commit suicide because their societies do not accept them in their society and segregate them. And those are one of the many examples of the charged moments of this debate that was happening in the halls of the United Nations. In the year 2000, when the United Nations, after the fall of the Wall of Berlin and all the context of a world where we thought the resources would go from war to development, to end poverty, to end sickness, to save women in childbirth and so on, were the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were approved, and disability was not amongst them. In the agenda of the world, disability was not there. All of the programs that had the decades on disability and so on were not sufficient to create the perception that you needed in the 193 countries to have disability on the line. We've tried to integrate them in the SDGs, this new 2015-2030 agenda, which will be approved next week in New York. In my analysis, we failed to put it in all the parts where we should have. And that demonstrates an incapability of the lobbying system we should have in civil society and disability societies to impress on those countries to do that. We have a study with American University on that, and I'm going to moderate a panel in New York on the 24th on that. Because we need to teach, and we need to build capacities of that civil society to be more effective in lobbying the international organizations, which are mandated to and obligated to respect the convention. But the bureaucracies are huge, and there are entrenched feudal combats between them, and sometimes we don't get there. I tend to say that disability is something that you're looking to as a vulnerable group. And the term vulnerable means many things. it's indigenous populations, it's women, it's children, it's persons with disabilities. So the new millennium document, the new post-millennium document will have integrated vulnerable groups. There's very limited specificity on disability. But having said that, I think that since the convention was approved in 2006 and will almost be a decade, this has gone from leaps and bounds to create a new dynamic, a new universal language on disability. The convention has been translated into a language where all disability is sort of comprised in this document. And the legislation has to adapt to that. The internal legislation has to adapt to that, and the workings of governments have to budget and have public policy according to that. And so you work in different phases. The 159 mark was something that we did not think would come so fast. From 59 to 93, there's 40 or something. The problem we have there is that many of those countries are countries in crisis, countries in war, and in many cases failed states. So we don't expect the 193 completely to be there. But we do think that the way it was formulated, it created a mechanism of monitoring every country. So every country presents a report. The same in the Committee of Torture, which I belong to, presents a report. To present a report at midterm, they have to look into all this thing. And I'll give you an example of that because it's theoretical. Accessibility. Accessibility was something that was unique. Now, let me tell you a story of Michael, if I may. I came to Harvard on his invitation many years ago, more on the side of treaty negotiations. And we were walking in front of the building where the Harvard Law Review has its operation. And Michael told me, I crawled up those stairs because there was no way I could get in when I was a member of the and this is Harvard, and this is the United States, and this is a very rich country. So I think we have an extraordinary effect on these people, on these people, and let me clarify that. Not only those who are disabled, but the stakeholders and their families and the people in their communities, because you're either born with a disability, which is a fact. You acquire it during your life by accident, by sickness, by war, by climate change, malnutrition. You can choose a whole range of them, but certainly when you age, you will be disabled. And that changes the concept of this minority group who's here and vulnerable and we should take care of it to all of us will be disabled. So we better put our act together and look at what's going to happen to our grandfathers, our fathers, ourselves in the future. And that universalizes the concept because you're immune to any reasoning when it's the other. And as Michael was saying, of course, there are differences in this world that are incredible and they will not be breached easily. While you talk in the United States about a wheelchair that goes upstairs for $30,000, in other countries there are no sidewalks. And a wheelchair is useless. And they don't want a wheelchair. They want a vehicle that can go through a path in a mud road, and wheelchairs don't do that. And you have to be sensitive enough to look into this issue and be sufficiently humble to say, there's a lot of things that we have to learn on a low budget scale that can be adapted from what these countries are doing. I work in a series of fields, and accessibility, of course, is one of them. I'm also chair of the Human Rights of the Universal Design Commission, which was a marvelous initiative of trying to create, and we're trying to standardize universal design in order for doors to be opened without knobs, because when you get to a certain level of age or you have a disability, you can't open the door. They have to be more of a, how do you say palanca in English? Okay, my translator. So the impression we get is that we have to move forward on a series of skills. The other issue of accessibility, which is under Article 9, was information and communication technology. I believe, and I chair a group called G3ICT, which believes that the use of inclusive information and communication technology will change many of the livelihoods of persons with disabilities. The iPad, the iPhones, and all these gadgets I'm just saying this without any reference to the maker, but the accessibility features of that can facilitate not only life, but the person access to work. And if you don't have work, you don't have dignity. And if you have the possibility of working in self-sustainment, that is the largest objective. When you talk about numbers, you have a billion people, according to the World Bank and the World Health Organization, that are disabled. 10%, 15% of the population. But those numbers do not reflect the elderly, do not reflect their stakeholders, who are the caretakers of those persons. So you get to a number around 3 billion. And 3 billion becomes a very impressive number for businesses. So G3ICT works with transnational corporations of communication to facilitate that. And we think that, in a country like Ecuador, where we're 14 million, there are more telephones than people. And so we do think that technology is the way forward to many of these cases. Where are we now? Now we are trying to teach the use of the tool in every country, but also in the universal world that leads to this point. Will we be effective as those stakeholders who wish to do this in reality? Because, one is a passerby in the world and in life, and the compliance with this has been extremely interesting and extremely, I'm very honored to do that. I feel very much attached to this issue. In many cases, they've asked me, do you have any personal relation? Is anyone disabled in your family? And I don't really have anyone who is disabled in my immediate family. I became an admirer of persons like Michael and persons with disabilities after working with them for many years and seeing their humanity, seeing their capabilities, and seeing the great contribution they make to have a holistic society. If you don't have differences, if you don't respect differences, the situation of having an integral society is very complex. And that is one of the challenges we face in societies. I'll end there. Nothing to do with my speech. I'm sorry. I'll probably send it to Juliet to post and you can look at it. But I'll stop there for any questions and answers. It will be an honor and a privilege. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here on the invitation of my good friends in Harvard. I find this a very, very unique moment in my life. Thank you very much.
We'll take some questions in a moment, but before we do, I'm going to ask you to stand up and join me. Michael and I, on behalf of the Harvard Law School Project, wish to award to Ambassador Gallegos our third Harvard Law School Project on Disability Award for creative contributions to human betterment. The first recipient is Albie Sachs, the South African jurist. The second, Rosie Abella of the Canadian Supreme Court. And if I could I read the citation?
Please.
This award is awarded to Luis Gallegos, consummate diplomat, creative advocate, compassionate humanitarian. The world is in your debt for your leadership in the development of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, for spurring the global United Nations Partnership for Inclusive Information, and Communication Technologies, and for your role on the UN Committee Against Torture. In an era in which it is all too easy to be cynical, you remind us of what persons with worthy intentions, deep wisdom, and steely determination can accomplish in helping global institutions fulfill their promise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can we take a picture? Thank you very much. I am even more honored. I didn't expect this.
So we have time for questions and comments, and please join in.
Yes, please.
I'm very touched by all the work you have done, Michael Stein, Sir Alfred. Ambassador Gallegos, like your colleague who was the first president of the Human Rights Council, you are really pioneers in this very difficult area. And I'm from Germany and worked for 30 years with UNHCR where we had disabled refugees. But now I wanted to focus, as I mentioned to Juliette before, it's one of the first public international law norms which can be fulfilled in democratic countries. And I refer to mine. My husband is from France, where you now see that the facilities are forthcoming. Parents have to fight for their children if they're disabled, but if they go to court, and one of my classmates from university, she set up an NGO for disabled people, and she has helped draft the legislation for the ratification of Germany. And I know firsthand how many she has been able to help getting your norms from the convention and then through the national law in ratification for implementation. I think you deserve this feedback. You know it, of course, but I know how difficult it is to protect refugees, and disabled people is even more difficult, perhaps sometimes. But it is possible, and it is possible thanks to your amazing example. And I think it has been inspiring for all of us here and many others. And I personally thank you very, very much, and wish you very well for the convention. Very proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd just like to make a comment here. I was extremely surprised because after being ambassador in New York, I was tasked with being ambassador in Washington. And then I went to Geneva. And I was very familiar with Geneva. I had been ambassador there before. I had worked on human rights for a number of years. I would go 2 or 3 times to the Human Rights Council and to the Human Rights Committees. And I was really taken aback when I found that the World Health Organization didn't have a resolution on disability. And when I spoke to Madame Chang, the Director General of the Health Organization, on disability, she acknowledged that the World Health Organization in all its history did not have. So a small country like mine, Ecuador, had to table a resolution in the World Health Organization because disability was not on the agenda. And we had to propose a program for the World Health Organization on disability, which they did not have. So we began to do this out of that example with all the other organizations. And one of them was the High Commissioner for Refugees. That is a tragedy in the world right now, and it's always been there. Lack of resources and hundreds of thousands or millions of people that are displaced not only by war, by climate change, by others, women and children in camps for 40 years, or in the middle of deserts, who have lost any spirit of life, are really. But amongst those, persons with disabilities. Natural disasters are another very big issue that we have worked at because it's more difficult to move a population who is fleeing from a flooding or a hurricane or a volcanic eruption. And Ecuador has become a showcase of that also because you need to have programs, you need to have in place solutions to this. I think the refugee and Antonio Gutierrez has been very instrumental in putting the agenda of refugees forward. But the biggest problem is resources. How you can feed hundreds of thousands of people in camps all over the world is a daunting task. And in that case also, you have to meet the people who are in that situation to understand what's happening in Europe or what's happening in many other parts of the world where they're not accepted. They think they're migrants when they're fleeing for their lives. And that is another world tragedy, which I hope governments and continents come to grasp as a solution one of these days. But thank you very much for your expressions.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Lydia Brown. My question is about the United States' so far failure to ratify the CRPD. So I've been in D.C. for the past several years, and I'm one of the many people with disabilities in the D.C. area that's shown up repeatedly on Capitol Hill to meet with staffers, to tell them the disability community supports this, a lot of other communities support this should really be ratified, and it continually fails to be ratified. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about both, I guess this is a two-part question, both the broader political landscape of why the United States has not really ratified the CRPD. All that we've been hearing is it's a group of people who are concerned about homeschooling, but that's about it. And then maybe the second part of that question is, moving forward, why do we think it is important for the United States to ratify the convention, and what kind of strategy should we be taking from the grassroots end to accomplish that? Because so far, the usual strategies have not proven to be very effective. And since, I'm in the United States, everybody is currently at this moment, but I live here. That's where my investment is in the country that I'm coming from. If I can't get it right in my own country, then what am I supposed to do in terms of supporting and providing whatever support I can to movements and organizations that are abroad as well?
I'll answer part of that question, and Michael will take the other. I was telling a story last night at dinner, and I'll repeat it here with the excuse of my friends. The American delegation, when we began this negotiation, was under the Bush administration, and it was fundamentally integrated by people from the Department of Justice. And the United States decided that they would not sign or ratify, and they would oppose any attempt to have a legislation of this type. Many of the arguments were that they already had ADA, and this was a lower bar legislation, and we explained that was true. You have marvelous legislation, and you've done work on it with ups and downs and cyclical issues of employment and so on, and it's been taken to court a number of times and so on. But we thought at the beginning, rather naively, that the United States would be a sort of guide in the process because they had the expertise, they had the techniques, they had everything that we needed to guide the process. But they began to oppose it. And typically what happens in a negotiation, and I'll just give you an example, the American delegation would raise its hand and say, we're not in agreement with having a convention. What we would suggest is studying the 193 legislations of the world and coming back in a decade. Okay, so that's sort of the phase in which you obstruct. But we were very much aided by groups of persons with disabilities who were leaders in the disability community in the United States. And I remember very well Alan Reich, who unfortunately died some years back, but who was instrumental in this with Dick Trumwald and others, and who managed to get the Bush administration to change its position. They invited me to Congress. I went to give my presentation in Congress. I was very honored by Congressman Lantos and others who were there. Really, people who had Lantos was a refugee from a concentration camp, a survivor of the concentration camps. So they understood this. And so the United States changed the delegation, and suddenly they became, we will not sign it, we will not ratify it, but we will be helpful, which in the long run, was a decompression of the pressure we have, because the Americans have the capability and the power to be followed by others. And if they think that they're under the American umbrella, even this, which touches their population immediately, they tend to bend. My experience, my personal experience, and is that we met with the transition team. I met with the transition team when President Obama won the elections, and Tony Lake and Susan Rice and others of his advisors before becoming governor sat down with us, and they asked us, and my personal answer was, I'm a member of the Committee Against Torture, so eliminate torture, eliminate Guantanamo, and sign the CRPD, and ratify the CRPD. And as I was ambassador in Washington a year and a half later, or maybe 2 years later, my wife and I were invited to the East Room of the White House where the president signed the convention. And that night I was traveling to Bangkok for a conference, and I was in Dulles Airport when my secretary calls me and says, they're asking from the White House if you to give you one of the pens that the president signs the convention. And I said, yes, of course. Should I wait for you to come from Bangkok, or should I go and get it? I said, go and get it now. And so I have it in my house in Quito, in a very distinct place. It reminds me of part of this negotiation with a very complex system that you have in the United States, and where lobbies and power brokers are very much entwined. But it also reminds me that things can change. And I become an optimist when I see that countries as powerful as the United States can change. Why the United States is important? Because it has capabilities that it can teach others. And I think President Obama, although it's not been ratified in the 2 occasions it's been moved, has created focal points in health, in the Secretary of Health, Secretary of Labor, and they have been very instrumental. And the one that works in the State Department is outstanding with Judy Heumann. Why do we need that? We need that for the World Bank or the Inter-American Bank, where the Americans have the majority of membership. And they can decide that if you build a hospital in any country in the world, it has to be accessible. And when you procure things for countries who have limited resources, it's extremely important that amongst the conditionalities, they be accessible. If you are going to buy thousands of computers for your education, they have to be accessible. And if we learn to do this and get the World Bank with the help of the members to do that, it's a giant step in the right direction. But you answer, please, Michael.
I'll try to be quick and politic while also welcoming Lydia for one of our good partner organizations. And please tell Ari I love him, but he owes me a phone call. The fast answer is there is some combination within the U.S. Congress of the politics of American exceptionalism. We don't sign things like the CEDAW or the CRC, but also a combination of the politics of fear that seem to pervade our democracy, and we seem to be generating fear and behavior from it. And it was very painful to see, for example, Bob Dole, the old lion, being wheeled in from the hospital to make one last grand stand in the Senate, and having his pleas falling on deaf ears. That was personally painful beyond that. Part of it has to do with the disability community ourselves. So during the negotiations, the large American DPOs were not there. DREDF, which is fantastic, it does all kinds of great stuff, basically said, we have the ADA, we've got enough problems, we're not going to be here. And they turned up very, at the 8th ad hoc session, and by that point, their input was not there. So we got to the point of moving for ratification, and it wasn't just an issue in the U.S. There was a point in the 8th ad hoc session as we were nearing adoption, and there was a side session of Ambassador McKay and Professor Quinn and myself, and we had the disability communities from all over the world. And we said, congratulations, brothers and sisters, it looks like we're going to we're going to win the race. But the bad, and that's the good news, but the bad news is it's not a marathon, it's a triathlon. We have to go back to our own countries and ratify, and then we have to make sure that it's real. And the groups were not prepared to think about that, and neither were we. So, UCID took up the flag very early, and with their own particular focus on how to do it, but there wasn't state-by-state town hall meetings of disabled veterans and people with intellectual disabilities and the autistic community and whatever showing up and making noise about why this matters and getting that back to Congress. Having said that, 61 votes first time around can also be viewed as a victory. It's come much closer than many others. And the third, not to criticize my classmate's husband, but the Obama administration, which has been marvelous on many things, and the president who absolutely kept his word to sign the convention and to send it for ratification. And all praise to him for that. Many of us, when we went and spoke at the White House about will we get support, will we get a push for ratification, we're told very clearly all our political eggs are going in the basket of Obamacare. And the best thing we can do for people with disabilities in the country is to break the healthcare versus employment divide, to remove the things that will remove, like pre-existing illness, etc. And that's the best that we can do for the community, and that's where all our capital is going. And that was a considered adult, maybe not to our taste, decision, and they stuck to it.
Time for another question or two or comment?
Yes, I have two questions. The first one is for Ambassador Gallegos. Could you speak maybe specifically about what you think Ecuador is doing well or better than the U.S. as far as scholastic or technological access for students, or what the U.S. is doing better and Ecuador could adopt? And then for Professor Stein, I think maybe, has there been any movement or thought in, there's more of a stimulus response access approach to information, library books and whatnot, I guess because of copyright. Do you think there's any movement, or would you support movement of maybe, for example, Harvard rebinds a lot of their books. When they acquire new material, they carefully clean it. If we would be able to scan and have that kind of information in alternate format, so it's available to students with handicaps or with disabilities before they request them, so they don't have to have that 2-week, 3-week wait, when their classes are pending and their assignments are due, but just have that information already available. If I could have those two questions answered, please.
I think the effort of changing the structure of the economy of Ecuador from a commodity-producing, basically petroleum country to a technologically based producer is a very adequate measure, because petroleum is a resource, a finite resource which eliminate, and the other ones are cyclical, and you see the crisis we're having in the commodity markets now. So higher education and the use of technology is very much what we should do. So any effort done by the country with cooperation from anyone else and creating hubs of technology and innovation are. I'll tell you my personal issue. My daughter works in a university, and her husband is a PhD in biology, in a very unique university in the jungles of Ecuador, in the middle of the jungles of Ecuador, that has 100,000 hectares of a reserve for investigation in biology in the Amazon. I think those things are done in the right direction. It'll take a lot of effort, but they've given scholarships for over 10,000 people for PhDs all over the world. When I was a young man, they would give 2 scholarships. So in a 14 million country, that's a very big effort, and I think they're going in the right direction. And from what I was speaking to the professor, they have a team of people from the Ministry of Talent coming to Harvard in the next a couple of weeks on this use of a technology application for persons with disability and integration. And this was done by a young American student who's blind that works in the ministry in Ecuador. So I think they're very good examples that we should grow on.
I'm embarrassed to say anything about ICT, information communication technology, when the global chair is here. But we have done in advance on the law side through the Marrakesh Treaty.
Yes.
And there'll be a workshop here at Harvard, when is it, November 6th, 7th, which is changing the perspective on it's a favor and an accommodation to rather, of course it's a right and there's a duty to include. But it comes about too slowly. And the default that we see in designs of websites, in the creation of the new architecture, which is embedding obstacles, is absolutely gratuitous and unnecessary. When it's put in to begin with, like your iPad, open it up and you can just enable the accessible features. You don't have to download, you don't have to put them in, they're just there. It doesn't cost. When they retrofit, it does cost, and it's purely a mindset. And free advertisement, 2016 Stein and Lazar ICT and Human Rights and Disability book will come out, and hopefully it'll be of some use to people. Harvard, it's always difficult to speak as a faculty member and be objective, and you know, we've seen the MIT and the Harvard X and other things. I would just say that the schools are remarkably uneven in their approach to valuing and accommodating and including students with disabilities. I think the law school is remarkably good, and our dean has stated, that we as faculty all have to provide accessible materials in advance, and that's not out of the ordinary. That's what we do. Our friends at the Ed School are wonderful and inclusive. But I also teach sometimes at the Kennedy School, and hopefully this won't get me fired. And some of my students are here, and I'm sorry, but the level of inclusion and the basic services that are provided are embarrassing. So it's a matter of culture as well. It's a legal obligation, but it's also a matter of culture and perspective and expectations. But quietly, things are getting better. It was embarrassing to see the Authors Guild sue the Hathi Trust, and I was one of the people quietly on the brief, where they went into court and said, well, we don't want all these documents in all these large university libraries digitized. We're going to lose money. Really? The blind students are out there paying cash down for it? Well, where's the loss? And it's troubling that there's that perspective and still that resistance to what ought to be basic human inclusion. It was argued in the Second Circuit just quickly. It was very funny because the 3 circuit court judges were all Yale graduates, and they sat there and asked the lawyer for the Authors Guild. You didn't pick up on that. Well, what if a student went to Yale and wanted to, and had a visual impairment and wanted to access that? Do you think that's wrong and you ought to be paid? And the lawyer just kept saying yes and yes and yes. So sometimes the lawyers help you.
To add a very quick comment, I think the last 2 questions point out something that's been central in our work, and that is that there is no perfection, that the U.S. and the advanced Western European countries, economically advanced, as a comment from Germany suggested, or Japan, all have a lot of work to do. So that's why the mutual learning is extremely important. And Michael and I have pressed here at Harvard. We will continue to do so. We welcome others to join us in that. Institutions change unevenly, as Michael said, but progress, thanks to him, has been made. Maybe that one metaphor of that is the law review building now has 2 elevators, and so people don't have to be dragged upstairs if they're in a wheelchair. Take time for one last question, and then we do want Ambassador Gallegos to have a chance to eat lunch. So we thanks to Juliet, we have a nice Peruvian.
Yes. And
lunch,
I have to thank her for the regional connotation of the food. Thank you very much.
She searched long and hard for an Ecuadorian chef, but this is close. Any last comment or question before we? Well, If not, let me again, on behalf of everyone, thank Ambassador Gallegos. Thanks, Professor Stein, and thank you all so much for coming. Please stay engaged with us. We have a sign-up sheet at the table, and we welcome your ongoing engagement, suggestions, criticisms, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.